I'm very happy to have this morning the possibility to interview Elisabeth Niklasson. Hi, Elisabeth, thank you for being here. So that accepted our invitation. And as we were just briefly chatting before starting the recording, Elisabeth is one of those scholars that also steered a bit the research of ex novo and the topic of interest of ex novo, and this is why we decided to invite her. As usually in these settings, I will give a brief introduction on our guest speaker today, and then we will start our conversation. So Elisabeth is currently lecturer at the University of Aberdeen, and specifically at the School of Geosciences, one in cultural heritage, if I'm not wrong, and one in archaeological computing. You also had quite some experience as a postdoc. You've been working in Stanford, and from your PhD and your postdoc days, your research interest steered more towards the ethics of heritage, the funding policies, and how identity politics of European heritage schemes are distributed, let's say, amid the many topics archaeology touches upon. And you've been also often in your work referring to how art sciences are actually today leading some of the funding, so they're kind of catchy and attractive, and we will try to understand this morning why is that so. So how, before starting with our questions, how did you start with this interest on European grants and policies behind European grants and the mechanics of funding research in archaeology?
Well, to make a long story short, I started looking into it already during my master's, because I came upon these applications, some funding applications online that were made to the the EU culture programs. And they had research questions in them, like aiming to prove the European identity using archaeology of an ancient peoples. So I was like, wow, are we not beyond these type of questions? And it seems really essentializing, and it seems like they already have the answer they're looking for, and they're trying to sort of reinvent this idea of a European people in the past to fit the European Union framework. So basically like a political applied archaeology of some kind. So I was surprised by that and interested to figure out how that happened. So I went into looking at the mechanisms of how funding drives some interests in archaeology and some of the questions we ask without us even knowing it sometimes. So we get incentives to write in a certain way, which some archaeologists told me they call it application poetry. And I think we all know what that means in our own cases. So yeah, and one of those settings that I looked at was how this application poetry worked in the EU funding circles, and what actually came out of those projects that wrote these type of questions that they were trying to find a European identity in the past. And it's sort of that way, even if I didn't look specifically into questions of aDNA and all of these modern trends that we see right now on migrations and all of these questions that are so tightly connected to questions of European grand narratives. That's how I got into it in the beginning, because I found these huge projects, like a project called Forging European Identities, that was all about migration and the population of Europe in the 3rd millennium BC. And in the Bronze Age in general. So yeah, I saw how those won more and more attention, and how it seemed quite easy to get money when you started to ask questions that had to do with origins, that had to do with migration, and then particularly having to do with aDNA when it boomed in around 2010 and onwards.
Yes, and we really thank you for that, because we are all victims of that application poetry. We all know there are a few guidelines that we have to follow to make it more catchy and attractive. And of course, the themes that are more attractive, they follow some sort of fashion. Let's say that's probably pretty human, but the mixing with art sciences and themes related to mobility, thus to identity, seem to be really the winner takes it all. So thank you for asking that question. That it's not really an easy, a comfortable zone where to be. So yes, aDNA, mobility, and prehistory. As you just said, indeed, since the ancient DNA revolution started, our vision and perspective on those dynamics, especially related to mobility, changed drastically. Now we know that in your work, you've been focusing on this shift of attention, but much of your work and your energy have been poured in prompting archaeologists to embed a bit more firmly those methodologies, this type of analysis, with a critical thinking. So genetic data should be assessed a bit more critically. Also to challenge the connection between biology and culture or material culture. So this is an invitation, a plea to complexity, of course, that it's not always easy to fulfill. It not always has been taken up by scholars and professionals. Still, we know, as we just said, that still research, genetic research, is the most popular, and we see it also in the amount of grants and money that goes into that. So why it's so appealing?
First of all, archaeologists have always, I would say, and that's a very positive thing for archaeology, both when working in the field and when working in research, they're very excited about new things. I mean, when radiocarbon came along, everyone was like, yeah, we were quite happy to start to integrate that in different ways, although there was a big debate at that point too. So as soon as we get some new tools to work with this extremely fragmentary materials that we have to deal with every day, we tend to want to implement them because we really want to know what went down in the past, right? So we do our very best to reach the best explanation we can. So there's also this, first of all, there's this, I think, this genuine curiosity and interest in how we can best implement new tools and new resources that we have access to. So that's part of it. But really, when it comes to aDNA in particular, I would say there are so many things that relates to why here. It's part that it was introduced at a time, at sort of a critical juncture when society, at least the global West, sort of started to turn more towards origin questions again. So there was sort of a backlash against this idea about plurality, about multiculturalism, all of this, and sort of turned inwards and became a little more isolated, more interested in origins of European peoples of different type. So it came at a time when that happened. Also, it has to do that it came at a time when polarization in society have been growing now more and more, and still is. So the question of where we come from, it's always been a very dangerous one in many ways, and also something we're very interested in. So I think this question of where do you come from, it's fine if you get asked like you're taking a taxi somewhere and the cab driver, oh, where are you from? That's fine. But if you're on the border and you're trying to enter Europe and you're in the refugee camps along the Mediterranean coast, being asked where you come from can be a matter of life and death. So archaeology, when we started to adopt this aDNA techniques, which has a tendency to appeal to origins and directly relate to seemingly giving a clear answer to the question, where do you come from? That is something that has become a real moneymaker and attention grabber. So people are interested in it for many reasons, but we've forgotten the part of how dangerous that question is sometimes, I think. Yeah, so that's part of it then, is that the societal, like what's happening right now and over the last 10 years have played into making the questions that aDNA can answer, how they explain that they can answer them, really seem extremely relevant. Also the new techniques, the new shiny bright techniques, especially next generation sequencing, which is the latest thing, which is much faster, somewhat cheaper than before. And also this discovery that you can use the petrous bone, this little bone inside your ear, to give a really dense, complex DNA sort of result. You can really, you can get much better results than before, than you have as well. So all of this, the question of origins, all of it has played into it. But then it's a question of academic politics. So, and there's where funding comes in. So it's this sort of, yeah, it's the application poetry. We have realized that origin sells, and we have realized what is new and shiny sells. And then we have biologists starting to be really interested in working with archaeology and archaeological materials, even if not always archaeologists themselves. When merging this all together, it becomes this really potent cocktail that attracts funders right away, because it's easy to grasp even if you have no knowledge about archaeology. So it taps into these questions that seem so important right now. So yes, a lot of the things that started to happen there, it's the high impact journals picked up on this just as the funders did. And also aDNA had this sense of being more of a true science than the critical humanities sciences had, that you can get clear results from aDNA. And as proponents in our fields, like Christiansen once wrote, that finally we don't have to rely on guesswork anymore. We can know for real about, where people came from in the past and how migrations worked. That's sort of, finally we have this third revolution coming on. As all of these ingredients came together in this potent cocktail and made aDNA the new thing, both for funders to fund and for archaeologists. So either you're on the train, basically, on the aDNA train, or you are left in prehistory, literally. So you don't, you have no chance of gaining funding or be part of it if you're part of the critical humanities side. That's how it's been portrayed in a little bit. I don't think it's entirely true anymore. Why and how, that's a little bit, part of the answer is in this cocktail, I think.
Yes, I have to say that as a ceramic specialist, of course, we also had years and years ago, decades ago, this sort of archaeometry hangover. So anything that would have the clear answers of science, of hard sciences, was taken more seriously than any guesswork a normal pottery specialist will in any case have to do in the storeroom. So hard sciences tend to have this side effect. It's like we don't trust that much our critical thinking and our work, our discipline. So
I think so. And it's also because the complexity is not very convincing. And when you're looking for convincing short statements that, that's like the takeaway points, if they come with an however, or nevertheless, or this is one interpretation, that doesn't really work in the times we live in when we are looking for this fast impact and ready-made answers. So it's hard. And I think it's been different in different points in time. Some periods, this sort of questioning has been more appreciated than it has in other times. So maybe, the cycle will turn around again.
Of course, towards another hard science or type of analysis. I would say that follow the money. It's helping to understand what the hot topics are in archaeology and the most rated methodologies. But if we follow the money, we can understand what are the hot topics in archaeology, or the hot topics in archaeology follow the money. It's both.
I think it's a little bit of both, for sure. But I think it has to do, I don't know. I guess it's always been influenced by societal trends, of course, archaeology has. But some argue that more so now than ever in sort of the wake of neoliberal logics in society, and how archaeology, just as any other topic, has to compete with a lot of other disciplines on sort of a more of a consumerist market.
So moving to our second question, it's of course again about the third scientific revolution, as I think defined by Christiansen. I don't think you agree, by the way. Then you will tell us if you agree with this term, a scientific revolution. We know that impacted archaeology, archaeological research, but not only, also all the other sectors. Do you think there is a difference in how genetic data has changed and impacted the work of archaeologists, not only in research, but for instance, in museums, in rescue archaeology, commercial sector? For instance, the relationship that we already talked about between mobility, human mobility, or migrations, and material culture is still, it has been a matter of a heated debate. Still, it's very hard to communicate the complexity of aDNA data to the public. And of course, depending on what role you have, whether you're working more into a museum or in the field or at a university, you will have to communicate differently this complexity. So how can we disseminate the critical thinking we were talking about in the first question to a larger audience?
So there are a lot of good questions in there. If I'm allowed to break it up a little bit. So first, like, I think all of them are really interesting and they all relate to each other, but they have slightly different answers for different sectors, I think. So when you think about like how this, the so-called third revolution has impacted archaeology in the different sectors, and how genetic data in different ways, the possibility of using it has changed the way archaeologists and heritage professionals work in different ways. I would say that on a day-to-day sort of basis, it has not changed really much what we do. It certainly has brought on a lot of new possibilities and a lot of new considerations to the table. So that has changed a lot. Considerations then that include, for example, destructive sampling that is needed for aDNA research. So is it worth it to destroy the bone sample? So that's a question that museum and collections struggle with a lot. Like, how should we deal with all of these requests that now come in because everyone is looking for this little ear bone? Like, should we just hand them over? And there's been evidence of that they have been sort of pressured in some ways to hand over all their material. So that's one thing that has affected directly the work of curators in collections and things like this. It's also led to a lot of questions of the risks involved for working, for example, with indigenous populations. So how archaeologists, like the impact of the results on living people today. So because often in many countries, as we know, with Native Americans, a lot of their claims to legal rights to land, for example, are based on proving ancestry. So what if the results come back different from what you expected them to be? And how will that impact the population in the area where you're working? So if you're a field archaeologist, you might not think too much about it, but now you might have, you have to really consider, will whatever I excavate now actually be tested for aDNA, and how might that impact the people we're working with here in this area? And then, when it comes to migration, which is a really good question as well, like how that has affected the way we think about that. What researchers have criticized, like for example, Martin Furholt, who has written a lot about migration and aDNA, is like how this old idea of pots versus pots equals people, how that has come back a little bit. This idea that, moving bodies, and as you said, like moving bodies is the same, that equals cultures, basically. Just as in the cultural historical archaeology, we talked about pots moving around and pots changing style must be a different people then. But we know it's much more complex than that. But when we're only looking at the biological material and genetic material, then we tend to go back to the pots equals people reasoning sometimes. So how can we communicate it more, this complexity of aDNA to the public? I think it's a really tricky one, and it's going to be tricky for archaeologists for a long time because it's really alluring. It's really easy to go into this, to start talking about the things that a lot of people might want to hear, like, oh, did they look like us? Did they have the same skin color? Do they have the same eye color as we do? And even though aDNA sometimes they have the possibility to answer some of these questions, we have to ask ourselves, why do we want to know what kind of eye color that they had? How will that say anything about the culture? How will that say anything about, what we will learn about their society by knowing their eye color? Is it relevant? And still we tend to fall into the trap of, that's what's, the news will blow up, it will, Nature will pick up the publication or whatever. So that's a danger of a temptation of working with this material, as we have seen from media coverage. There's a lot of things to say. Like, I like to think of it as almost, when I think about how should we deal with the public when it comes to critical topics in general, like working with genetic material and how to talk about those results, that we should think of it almost as political election campaigns, that we are not sort of trying to preach to those who already have a clear idea of what the past is. You know, the people around the dinner table at, you know, you go to a party or something and they like tell you all about Bronze Age spears or something. So they you know, they watch documentaries all the time and they probably know more about some archaeology than we do. So they already have a pretty clear idea what the past is all about. And it, you know, a lot of things might strengthen that picture, but not a lot of things will change it to a more critical one. And then we have the people who don't care about prehistory or heritage at all in any way. And that's okay. If not everyone has to care about heritage and archaeology. And that's this thing now, like has been talked about, you know, this tyranny of participation, that how everyone has to love archaeology and be part of archaeology. I think it's fine that, you know, we don't have to preach to people who don't have an interest. But what they do in election campaigns, and what I think of as archaeological dissemination, is to talk to the undecided. So the people who are really interested, who follow archaeological news, who tell their kids about what they read, you know, these new discoveries. So if we can forge some more critical questions into that, some more critical thinking into when we talk to that group of undecided peoples, I think then we can really make a change, and we can, you know, it can work more sustainably with how we distribute our information. So, but it's all about, I think, weaving in questions into our interpretations, and not be afraid to add the element of uncertainty, to not say that we have rewritten history once again. Yeah, no, we have added a part to history that explains one thing or another, making it more complex and therefore more interesting. That's a long answer, but that's, yeah, that's sort of what I think of, like how we can approach it from a lot of different sectors.
No, but that's very clear. And it was a complex question indeed. I mean, first, we should also educate ourselves to knowing that aDNA doesn't hold the truth, as you just said. So it's not always the solution to the riddle. So the same flexibility that we have to learn as archaeologists should be transferred to the public or to any other stakeholder. But of course, if they want to, unless if they want to hear that there are more layers and complexity, that's of course the case. But yes, I think your point also on trying to understand why we want to know the physiognomy, for instance, of one of the burials in one necropolis, it's a central one. It really is. So it's probably also part of, as you just said, of our work to change the questions and to try to see whether, yes, we can also steer a bit the fashionable topics towards something different. So we now come back to the fundings and follow the money and see who's steering who. So we just stated that a growing number of European grants are financing research based on aDNA analysis, especially related to human mobility, to tracing migration. What do you think will be the long-term effect of such funding policies on our discipline? So will it be beneficial to all archaeologists, all latitudes, or will it kind of deepen the differences and probably create a greater divide between archaeologists working in the field, those carrying out the actual analysis, and those that will then interpret those data and craft overarching narratives? So I guess in our question, there is already sort of answer. We know that this is a very dangerous topic and that this can actually widen up the divide between North and South, East and West. But are we still on time to reverse this trend?
I think there is some potential to do it. And I think there are incentives now, and there are discussions that are ongoing that are starting to become more and more nuanced as we go and less defensive. So usually, like in the last years, a lot of people have been taking sides, digging their heels in, and like, you know, either like being really pro aDNA research and let's just do it, let's figure out let's deal with the consequences later on, like just, you know, just let's do this. And then we have the people who are like, let's not do it at all before we know what we want to know and before we know what we're doing, so just stop, basically. So I think that's like been a pretty locked discussion, but it is getting more nuanced. So people are coming up with ways of how to change the wording used. So part of like big issue of aDNA research is how they speak about ancient cultures. So they might not, you know, they use the terms, you know, like Yamanaya and all of these population groups without really considering that they might not be real categories to begin with. So yeah, the nomenclature is changing, and that's something that the critical debate has brought up. So that's good. I think it can be beneficial for everyone eventually if we can find some good middle ground. A couple of things need to happen for that to be possible. First, we need to embed this the sense of ethics in all aspects of working with aDNA. So in the questions we ask, and also to have an idea of what you want to know before you start asking for bone samples, instead of harvesting bone samples and just testing it all. We can't see people who are in the field and excavating as the storage workers or the producers of the information that will then feed into the real science, but they are part of it too, obviously. They are part of the research process. So to sort of embed ethics all along the process, I think, is really important. And then we have to situate aDNA in archaeological thinking and practice. And this is something we haven't really done yet. It's like a puzzle piece that won't quite fit. So I think we need to figure out where it fits in the archaeological thinking and in the, you know, in the history of the discipline, basically. Is it just another method? Is that how we should see it? Is it a whole new field, as it seems to be growing into now? You know, radiocarbon dating is a comparison that is often made, but we don't have a field that is completely working only with radiocarbon dating. We have to sort of figure out how we should relate to it and integrate it based on that properly in all the different parts of the discipline. And this is something that will take a long time. So we can't really expect it to change in the coming years, but I think there is hope that these more nuanced discussions will grow, and that there will be more of an interest from population geneticists to understand also the theoretical basis of archaeological reasoning, that there is a two-way relationship there. And then, of course, that we better understand how they reason, so that we don't just, you know, see, oh, it's cultural historical archaeology, it's essentializing. Let's, you know, we can't just put labels on them either, because that's not fair. Understand, basically, it's not a one-man, one-woman show here. You know, to really work together with both theory and methods, sort of to figure out how we fit together. Pretty general answer, but I think there are a lot of different ways to do this. And in my other research, when I talk about funding issues and politics relating to that, I always say that we need to work better across sectors. So academia really needs to be better engaged with the professional heritage sector in the agencies, state agencies and similar, all the way down to excavations and contract archaeology as well.
Yes, definitely. I think there is something that is embedded in the nature of our discipline, which is borrowing from other disciplines. It doesn't matter whether it's anthropology or biology or chemistry or anything else. But sometimes, yes, borrowing the methods doesn't mean to borrow also the theory and the philosophy behind. So that's definitely an underexplored part of the deal when it comes to aDNA. Probably. I have just one last curiosity. While I was browsing your profile, I've noticed that among your postdoc experience, you also had some direct experience with the administration of European grants. Have you been working from inside? So you saw at a certain moment how the policy, the administration of European grants actually work. Would you share with us a bit what your experience was?
Yeah, that was really interesting. What I found, and that's why my conclusion basically of that research was that even if it's just application poetry, it matters. So, and particularly if we write something in an application to please a funding source, especially when they have some sort of political motive, if we then decide to basically copy paste our application poetry into the final report to the funder about what we discovered, that has effect, because seeing from the inside how policy develops in the field of culture, I realized that they like to take those reports, the final ones, and not to look at the science part of them, or how well they argued, or what kind of things, about prehistory they came up with, but to use them basically to see if their money renders the kind of important research that we need right now. If they see that we can answer those kind of questions, and they automatically find that, yeah, no, it seems really relevant and interesting, that they found that this European identity actually does have a long history, then that feeds into new policy. So this is a culture of auditing and evaluation when you make policies. So I saw that when they audit and evaluate all of those, I looked at 160 archaeological grants that was placed to this program, and then to see what happens with the results. And I saw how they fed back into this. I also saw the funding panels. I was part of the funding, like the evaluation panels that decided which grants got funding and which did not. And I realized that it's all a bit haphazard. It's quite often that you don't have an assessor that has any expertise in your field that is being assessed. Sometimes you get someone from theater, or sometimes in culture area. Sometimes you get someone from geography, and they will come in with the idea, and maybe if they read something that talks about aDNA and migration and origins, and they will be like, wow, that's great. So you have to be critical already in your application poetry, in a sense, to make sure you don't create this feedback loop that goes back into policy.
So the insider's view opened up avenues for further research, I guess, because of course also the way they are assembling a committee, it will dictate the decision in a way. And in your experience, someone from theater or art environment will be drawn to those very wide research question more than something a bit more specific, I guess.
Anything that they will be drawn to things that are easy for them to conceptualize within their own field of thinking.
Yeah.
So if you have someone from post-colonial studies and in anthropology, and they get an aDNA proposal talking about Yamanaya or something, they will be very critical, and they might not give it a very high score on the science part or the questions that they pose. But yeah, if you get someone from a field that doesn't have a critical tradition in the same sense, then they will likely, as I saw in these panels, they will really base their judgment on if it's a good and comprehensive and interesting idea that the project has to them.
Yeah, the insider's view probably taught you a lot, and it's what we all are exposed to, of course. I guess doing that from inside will give you a completely different perspective.
It also makes you very humble, because everyone is just really trying to do their best, and the time pressure is quite high to get these things sort of reviewed, and everyone's doing it as on top of their other type of work. And so it's not like an elitist fancy thing to go and be a reviewer in Brussels. It's quite stressful, and you have a certain quota to meet every day of proposals to review, hundreds of pages to go through. So for me, it was also like, what can you really do under those circumstances? You don't have time to look into anything more than if the project has a really good idea.
Thank you very much, Elisabeth, once again for your time. And in case there will be questions from our virtual audience in a week, I will forward them to you, and I think there will be many. So thank you once again, and I hope we will have the possibility of crossing paths in the future.